Hi, I'm Brock.
I'm Jim.
Before we get started, if you want to stay ahead of the cattle markets, sign up for our free daily briefing at herdadvisor.com. It's delivered right to your inbox every morning, 5-minute read. And if you've ever wished you could keep complete cattle records without the clipboard, the Cattle Record Guide lets you enter records from the field with your gloves on. Just say, "Hey Siri, try it free for 14 days at herdadvisor.com. Good morning and welcome back to Cattle Market Guys. It's Tuesday, July 14th, and we've got a lot of ground to cover today. Let's start with where things stand right now in the cash market. According to the data, 500 to 549 pound steers came in this week at $451.20 per hundredweight, and that's actually down from last week's $456.53. Meanwhile, 600 to 649 pound steers are sitting at $414.47, which is up slightly from the $421.80 we saw the week before. Jim, what do you make of that split?
So the lighter cattle are sliding and the heavier ones are creeping up. That's a mixed bag if I ever saw one.
It really is, Jim. And the futures market is telling a similar story of hesitation. The front month is at $360.89, down from $367.94 just 2 weeks ago. The article from the cattle site on July 11th confirms this. Cattle futures fell as post-holiday beef demand faded. Then 2 days later, on July 13th, we saw cash cattle prices tumble $7 on the week, which put even more pressure on those live cattle futures.
$7 in a week will get your attention real quick.
It will. And here's where it gets interesting. Despite that cash weakness, the July WASDE report released today actually raised the cattle price outlook for the third quarter of 2026, citing strong June prices as the foundation. So we've got a short-term dip butting up against a longer-term bullish revision. Looking at our predictive models, the 500 to 549 weight class is forecast to bounce back to $436.79 next week and climb to $450.77 by week 2. That's a pretty strong signal that this current softness might be temporary.
Well, temporary or not, if you're marketing calves this week, that $7 drop is real money out of your pocket, temporary or otherwise.
Fair point. And volume matters here too. Most of our transactions this week fell into that average volume category, which tells us we're not seeing panic selling or a flood of cattle hitting the market. That's actually somewhat reassuring given the price softness. Now let's dig into why this volatility is happening in the first place, because there's more to this story than just seasonal demand.
Let's hear it.
So our first deep dive today centers on what's driving these cattle price and futures market movements, and the data points to a few converging factors. As we mentioned, cash cattle dropped $7 on the week according to that July 13th CME report, and that's pressuring live cattle futures across the board. But here's a critical piece. Feeder and stocker cattle marketings for the week ending June 27th came in 39.6% lower than the 3-year average. That's a massive shortfall in supply reaching the market.
39% below average, that's not a dip. That's a drought of cattle showing up at the barn.
Exactly. And when you combine light marketings with falling cash prices, you get exactly what we're seeing. Thin, choppy price action that can swing hard in either direction depending on who's selling and when. The wholesale beef side actually bounced during the same period, but it wasn't enough to offset that cash price weakness. So processors are dealing with tighter supplies, but buyers aren't necessarily paying up for them yet. Jim, does this remind you of anything you've seen before?
You know it does. Back in '96, we had a similar situation, though for different reasons. That drought out in West Texas forced a lot of us to liquidate herds early because the grass just wasn't there. Marketings ran way below normal, kind of like what we're seeing in this report, and it created these thin, choppy cash markets with sharp swings depending on who was forced to sell that week.
What happened with pricing during that stretch?
Grass was gone by June of '96, and we had to start hauling cattle to the sale barn before we wanted to. Trouble was, everybody in 3 counties was doing the same thing, so some weeks the barn was packed and prices dropped fast, and other weeks nobody had anything to sell, and prices would jump right back up. My neighbor sold his calves on a Tuesday when the market was soft, and I held mine 2 weeks and got near $40 more ahead just from the timing.
That's a remarkable difference just from timing alone.
When volume runs light and uneven like it is now, the market gets nervous and jumpy. Patience on timing can be worth real money, but you've got to have the grass or feed to back that patience up. That's the catch.
That's sound advice, and it directly applies to what we're seeing today. With marketings running nearly 40% below the 3-year average, Producers who have the flexibility to hold cattle even a short time might catch better pricing on the other side of these swings. The WASDE report backing a stronger Q3 outlook suggests that patience could pay off here too, assuming you've got the resources to wait it out like Jim's neighbor didn't.
That's about as useful as a screen door on a submarine if you're out of hay, though.
True enough. Let's shift gears now and look at what's happening on the trade and export side, because there's a data integrity issue here that producers really need to understand. According to the article from the cattle site, USDA slashed beef export figures by 90% after discovering a data error. We're talking about sales to Chile and Italy that were originally reported as record highs, and those numbers have now been revised down to near zero.
90%? That's not a rounding error, that's a whole different report.
It really is concerning because this sparks legitimate questions about the quality of USDA's export data overall. If we can't trust the export numbers coming out of Washington, that creates real uncertainty for anyone trying to plan around international demand. Meanwhile, on the import side, total U.S. beef imports for the first 5 months of 2026 are up 9.9% year over year, according to the Cattle Range article. So we're importing more beef while our export data is proving unreliable.
Well, that's a heck of a combination. We're bringing more in and we don't even know for sure what's going out.
Precisely, and this matters because export demand is a major price driver for the cattle market. If those Chile and Italy numbers were inflated in the original reporting, that means some of the bullish sentiment we might have priced into futures could have been built on faulty information. Producers need to watch for USDA's corrections and be cautious about reading too much into any single export report until we see how this shakes out over the next few weeks.
I've always said you can't feed cattle on good intentions, and apparently you can't trade on bad data either.
There's also an international disease angle worth mentioning here. South Africa's government announced it's opening up FMD vaccination access to the private sector, allowing them to import, distribute, and administer foot and mouth disease vaccines. This follows a lawsuit settlement over what was seen as a slow government response to an outbreak. While this doesn't directly impact U.S. markets today, disease control and trade access are deeply connected. Countries with better disease management typically have more reliable export access, and that affects global beef flows and eventually U.S. competitiveness in international markets.
Anytime you hear about foot and mouth disease, that's worth paying attention to, no matter what country it's happening in.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that this is a global industry and disease events anywhere can ripple through trade patterns everywhere. Now let's move to our final segment, which covers regulatory changes and processor support that's directly relevant to anyone in the supply chain right now. Starting July 20th, USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service is expanding metals testing to cover 18 different metals in processed meat and poultry, including lead, thallium, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury.
18 metals, huh? That's a lot of things to be testing for in a hamburger.
It is a significant expansion, and mercury reporting specifically is new to this testing regime. For processors, this means additional compliance costs and potentially new equipment or lab partnerships to meet these standards starting next week. But there's a financial cushion here too. USDA announced $80 million in federal support for small meat and poultry processors. $20 million of that is allocated specifically for overtime fee reductions, and $60 million goes toward the meat and poultry processing expansion program.
$80 million sounds like a lot until you spread it across every small processor in the country.
That's a fair point, and it does connect to what we talked about with the export data issue. There's a broader theme this week of regulatory reliability and oversight capacity being tested across USDA's various functions. Jim, this actually reminds me of something you've dealt with before regarding compliance costs hitting smaller operations hardest. What happened back then?
It sure does. Back in '94, I remember the little processing plant we used over in the next county about had to shut its doors when USDA started tightening up on.
That's all for today. Remember to sign up for our free daily briefing at herdadvisor.com. And if you want complete cattle records without the hassle, try the Cattle Record Guide free for 14 days. Enter records from the field with your gloves on. Just say, "Hey Siri."
Catch you in a couple days.
All right, see you then.